Jim. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight on a rather sultry August evening for those in New York. It's been a hot day. And I want to also extend a very warm welcome to anyone for whom RPA is new or RPA's programs are new. This new guest speaker series that we're launching tonight, it's really about building new relationships in the community. And so we're really happy that you're here. As Jim said, we're going to try to save questions to the end, and we have a big crowd tonight. So before I introduce our speaker tonight, Heather Bruegl, I want to say a few words about why we asked Heather to be here and really why we created this guest speaker series that starts now and goes into December. And so I invite you all to contemplate something, and you might even want to close your eyes in order to let your imagination go a little bit. So the land that we call the Rensselaer Plateau and Rensselaer County sits within the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee band of Mohican people. Looking up this history, I read that the Mohicans were here for around 14,000 years before European settlers arrived. However, recently when I asked Bonnie Hartley, who is the historic preservation manager for the Stockbridge-Munsee community about this, she said, well, actually, they consider that their people have been on this land from the beginning of time. And they did not own the land, rather they were or are still part of it. Their name means people of the waters that are never still, referring to the Mohican, which we know as the Hudson River. And although the Munsee Mohican people were forcibly removed and pushed westward and eventually resettled in Wisconsin, this land is still home to them. So as present-day stewards of this land, at RPA, we acknowledge and we honor the area's original stewards. And as a land trust, we feel it is our responsibility to really make nature a safe and welcoming place for everyone, and to include all voices at the table in our community conservation work, because community conservation is for everyone, nature is for everyone. To date, we have mostly served a white community, and we know that the history of land conservation in the US has often excluded and harmed Indigenous people and people of color. So as one step to sort of restory this, or even to begin to heal these relationships, the RPA board and staff have worked hard to create this series, this guest speaker series, and to spread the word, to bring in new people and new voices. Our goal is really to expand the circle of who is heard and who is included. So tonight we're starting with Heather Bruegl, who I will finally introduce in just a second. But I want you to also take note of the next 3 talks. So the series is 4 talks in all. Keith Hirakawa, who is an RPA board member, will be speaking on September 23rd. Chaya Harris and Benita La Diao of Outdoor Afro on October 28th. And they will be talking partly about a newly formed local Outdoor Afro chapter, which is very exciting. And then finally, Celia Cutts of Rensselaer Youth Outdoors will speak on December 2nd, and she'll be doing some integration and implementation of the things that we're learning in the series. So it will build, the series will build on itself, and we encourage you to attend as many as you're able. You can read about all those others and register on our website. So finally, it is my great pleasure to introduce Heather Bruegl. Heather is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. She is a graduate of Madonna University in Michigan and holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts in US History. Her passion for Native American history was sparked by a trip to Wounded Knee in South Dakota. And since then, Heather has been what she calls an accidental activist. She speaks to different groups about intergenerational trauma and racism, and helps to bring awareness of our environment, the fight for clean water, policy and activism, and other issues in the Native community. A curiosity of her own heritage led her to Wisconsin, where she has researched the history of the tribes in the area. And up until yesterday, Heather was the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And as of today, she is the Director of Education for the Forge Project, which is based, I think, in Columbia County. I read about it and it sounds really interesting. So Heather might share a little bit about that as well. And with all that, I hand it over to Heather, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, yesterday, how fitting. Yesterday was my last day working for the community. And so I am moving on to a new adventure. I want to do two disclaimers really fast. I have three very large dogs in the background. They should be good. They're all sleeping right now. But if I quickly mute myself, if I stop talking, it's because they've started barking and I'm trying to calm them down. But they should be really good. Second disclaimer is I was also having internet issues this morning. I went out to Best Buy. I think I solved the problem. So I think we're all good. We're going to be good there. If not, I have the link up and everything. So I will like pop back in. But yeah. So my name is Heather Bruegl. My name in our language is Kishikunkwe, which means sunflower in full bloom. And I was given that name last September during the naming ceremony, so it's very important to me. It's not a name that I use very often, but I think it's, when I'm talking about our people and who we are, I think it's important to talk about that. I also want to let you know that I'm coming to you from my home, which is seated on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Menominee Nation, whose ancestors that I pay respect to by doing things like this, by talking about our history, by letting people know who we are as Indigenous people and that we are still here and that we are still around and we have gone absolutely nowhere, that we're stronger than ever. And so I'm very honored tonight to be talking about one of my home communities, the Stockbridge-Munsee community. As stated earlier, Annie let you know that I am an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, but I'm a first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. So I'm not enrolled in Stockbridge-Munsee, but I'm first-line descendant, which means in this particular case, my mother is enrolled, but I am not. And that is just based on a colonized setup called blood quantum. And so that's something that is totally, could take hours to explain, but the Stockbridge-Munsee are my people. I consider myself an Oneida Mohican woman. And so these are my ancestors. I have very strong Stockbridge-Munsee ancestry and a history that goes back prior to the arrival of Henry Hudson. So I'm really honored to talk with you all tonight about who we are, because we are not the last of the Mohicans. I picked this title because if you're not aware, there was a book called Last of the Mohicans, James Fenimore Cooper, written in 1826, that kind of romanticizes the French and Indian War with some bits of truth in there. I am a historian first, so when he is really talking about the French and Indian War and the battles, that is all real, but everything else was romanticized in it. And so that I feel even prior to working for Stockbridge-Munsee was a narrative that I felt I was constantly combating, that it was something that you know, we were constantly fighting. And then being in the trenches, working for Stockbridge-Munsee community and having people say to me, you know, oh, you guys know that book, Last of the Mohicans, almost jokingly, not understanding that that title has been handed down through centuries as something that is real. That we're the last of the Mohicans, but we're not. We're still here. We're still thriving. And so tonight, I'm really honored to be able to tell you about who we are, our history, all the way up into who we are today in 2021. So I hope you maybe learned something you didn't know before. And as was stated earlier, your questions can go in the chat and they'll be filtered to me at the end of the talk. I do definitely want to leave plenty of time for question and answers because I do feel that we learn a lot through Q&A. So here we go. The last of the Mohicans. So first, I think it's important to talk about our territory. Now you'll notice in our name, Stockbridge-Munsee community, right? Band of the Mohican Indians. So Munsee is part of the Lenape So that is part of our history. And I'll explain how we got our name later on, but I want to let you know where our territory is first. So our territory covered about 6 states, from southwest Vermont, the entire Mohicanatuck River Valley of New York, from Lake Champlain to Manhattan, western Massachusetts up to the Connecticut River Valley, northwest Connecticut, and portions of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And we also did have some very random settlements in Kansas, and that was during Indian removal, which was passed in 1830. We did have some community members that left Wisconsin and moved down to Indian Territory, but then turned around and came back. You'll notice on this map here, we have 2 circles, well, ovals, whatever, shapes that kind of outline our territory. The top part, you will see where you see Albany, and then that second circle is actually Stockbridge, Massachusetts, all the way up to Lake Champlain, and then coming down. That is our Mohican territory, our ancestral unceded lands of the Mohican people. The circle below it, where you see New York City outlined, that is the Munsee Lenape territory. When we consult on projects, when we talk about our history, we include that land because it is part of who we are as Stockbridge-Munsee people. So just so you have that clarification. So in essence, it's really from that top portion of Lake Champlain all down through New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So that's a pretty big area that we cover. And we'll talk more about that later on when I talk about what the functions of the Cultural Affairs Department, the department that I used to run, do, because it's important to know that we are still active in that area today. So who are the, hold on, my video just went out like by itself. That's okay. So who are the Stockbridge-Munsee people? We're Mohicans. We are known as the River Indians. We settled along the Mohicanatuck, which is the river that flows both ways, which is today you know as the Hudson River. We are the Mohicaniac people, the people of the waters that are never still. That is our name in Mohican language. We were closely aligned with the Lenape. And at one point in time, we referred to them as the grandfathers, and there was a strong alliance. So if they needed something, they could call on us. If we needed something, we could call on them. We numbered, the Mohican Indians numbered around 25,000 or more at a point in time. There are some dueling histories on our numbers. One says a flat out 25,000. Another version says it was 25,000 warriors, which would ultimately mean it was more people. So there is debate, but regardless, we were a very large nation at one point in time, covering the entire Mohicanatuck River Valley and the Berkshire area. So it's very important to note that. These were our homelands. And clearly we're no longer there. And even while we were there, we lost part of our land through shady land agreements, agreements in quotation marks, because it's not necessarily, they weren't agreements that were made that we knew what we were agreeing to. One would argue, and I would argue, that all land from Indigenous people is unceded because agreements or treaties were written in the language of the colonizer, which was English. It was not our language. So how could we consent to something that we didn't understand? So through these shady deals, we slowly started to lose land in the Mohicanatuck River Valley. And that's important to note because land is central. Land and language are central to who we are as Indigenous people, and the land means something to us. Just about a little over a month ago, at the end of June, beginning of July, I, for the first time, was able to travel to the homelands. We opened an exhibit in Stockbridge, Massachusetts at the Mission House, Mohican Miles. I encourage you to go visit it. And I clearly live in Wisconsin, but when I was there in New York and Massachusetts in our homelands, there was definitely a sense of feeling at home. I didn't feel out of place. There was a strange sense of peace and calmness being in those homelands. So that land today, even though we're not there, that land today still means something. It still calls you home. And when you are there, it really, so that's really important to note as well. We had encounters with explorers pretty early on in our history. And most of the East Coast tribes did. You had the Pilgrims encountering the Wampanoags and us encountering the Dutch. So early on, colonization started on the East Coast. And that is also why a lot of tribes on the East Coast either number one, were moved, and number two, were moved and there was that loss of history because everything happened so early on. So our journey with settlers, explorers, colonizers, whatever word you choose, started in 1609 when Henry Hudson came sailing up the Mohicanatuck into the land of the Mohican people. With that sail, with that encounter in 1609, life was going to change forever for the Mohican people. That's true for any indigenous tribe. The first time you encounter the colonists, life is going to change forever. By 1614, there was a fur trading post that was established at present-day Castle Island. And that inception of the trading post, the fur trading post, would then change the economic way of life for the Mohican people. It also started already tense relations. It made them even more tense. And so that became true with us and the Mohawk. There was something that was started called the Beaver Wars. And these were battles for economic dominance in the area because beaver was a very coveted pelt. The Dutch and people in Europe just went crazy for it. So they wanted this. And so you had tribes working against each other to see who could dominate that trade. And it was mainly because we're talking about that New York area. It was mainly the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy. And Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse, which is the Six Nations against everyone else. And in our case, it was particularly us against the Mohawks or the Mohawks against us, whichever way you want to look at it. And in 1628, the Mohawks defeated the Mohicans and pushed us east of the Mohicanatuck and created a monopoly of trade with the Dutch in what was called New Netherland. So these were economic battles that were happening, economic battles for dominance that were happening, with the Mohawk eventually winning out over the Mohicans and pushing us farther out of our homelands. The fur trade, however, also brought a decline in the beaver population, and the animal all but disappeared from the Mohicanatuck River Valley by 1640. Economic way of life for the Mohicans changed with contact, as I stated earlier. Traditional items were no longer being made. New items such as iron kettles, guns, cloth, and colorful glass beads were now available. And I'm actually doing some research on the inception of beads and how they changed the way we did business, the way we lived, the way we traded, because that's really important. And beads, you will find if you do any research in Indigenous history, beads are something that are very valuable and something that is used in trade. So when you hear about the sale of Manhattan, you hear that there were colorful glass beads that were used as payment in that sale, quote, sale. Because that's debatable by a lot of historians. Historians go back and forth on that. But glass beads changed economic way of life forever for the Indigenous people. With that also came the dependency on goods from the the colonists, and thus a paternalistic relationship between Native nations and some form of government is formed, even today in 2021. There is that parent-child relationship, with the parent being the federal government and the child being the Native nations. We are also at one point considered wards of the federal government. So there is that very much paternalistic way of thinking, which is interesting because most Native tribes are actually matrilineal. So it's interesting to think about it in those terms. Like many Native nations, and particularly those on the East Coast, forced movement was inevitable and it was going to happen. We were eventually driven out of our territory west of the Mahicanatak. In the early 1700s, the Mohicans moved further east near the Housatonic. The English now replaced the Dutch in the area, so we went from one set of colonists to another set of colonists, and eventually the British became the dominant force in that area. And with that, this started under the Dutch too, but it very much continued on when the British took control. There was this idea of civilizing Native people, and that way of thinking has never really gone away. If you are familiar with federal Indian policy and the idea of blood quantum and treaties and all of that, there is this idea that we need to be tamed because we're savages. We live, recklessly, and we don't worship a Christian God, and there's plural marriage and children are just running around. And so there's these myths about Indigenous people because we weren't living what I consider a Eurocentric lifestyle, when in turns we were just living how we were living. It was good and peaceful and prosperous and everyone was happy. But colonists came in, and that being unfamiliar to them determined that we needed civilization. And so then even so much to the point, with the Declaration of Independence is written, if you read it closely, and I'm a student of colonial history. So if you read the Declaration of Independence closely, in there it refers to us, the Indigenous people, as merciless Indian savages, right? We are something that needs to be tamed because we are bloodthirsty and all of this other. So there was this idea of trying to civilize us. One of the things that they did in order to try to civilize us was create boundaries. The idea of the modern boundary that we see today, like I know if I'm leaving Wisconsin, if I'm heading south, I know when I cross into Illinois because there's a sign that tells me and I've crossed a boundary. Those types of colonial boundaries did not exist in Indigenous communities. We had ideas of whose territory was this and whose territory was that, but there was shared common ground, whether that was hunting ground, whether that was gathering ground. It was common and it was held in communal by each other. So there was that understanding. Colonists come in and they start to erect walls and fences to keep particularly us Indigenous people out. If we were sharing a plot of land with you, a wall or a fence went up because we wanted to make sure, or the colonists wanted to make sure, the Indigenous people knew where they stood and you couldn't come. One of the most famous is Wall Street. Wall Street got its name because it was a wall, right? So, and you start to see Wall Street pop up on maps in the late 1600s. So it is a very old boundary that was put up by the Dutch to keep us out. And since the lands were declared to belong to the Europeans by right of discovery, you can also interpret that as the doctrine of discovery set forth by the Catholic Church, Mohicans couldn't defend their ownership in the courts of the colonists. We didn't have the opportunity to do that. We weren't able to defend our land rights in courts because these were just right of discovery claims by the colonists. And as more settlers started to arrive, not just Mohicans, but other Indigenous nations in the area became dependent on the settlers in order to survive. It's that economic way of life changing. We became dependent on the goods that they had in order for us to continue to feed our families. But also with the arrival of more settlers and colonists, disease also arrives. So smallpox, measles, diphtheria, and scarlet fever, just to name a few, arrive in, quote, the New World. And we, as Native people, completely unfamiliar with these diseases, did not have immunity for these diseases, we begin to die. And hundreds of thousands and sometimes entire villages would be completely wiped out by these foreign diseases. There are numerous readings that you can look back to, primary sources written by pilgrims and others who came in and would stumble upon literally empty villages. And this is because disease had swept through and took out the indigenous people. So I want to take a moment and talk a little bit about the idea of missionaries and Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which is a significant place in our Mohican history. So missionaries arrived soon after colonists and entered Native villages to help convert Native people. Native people agreed to be Christianized after seeing the prosperity of the settlers. There was this idea, they're prosperous, if we convert, we'll be prosperous as well. And many also converted to survive. It's very interesting to think about my ancestors in particular converting to Christianity in order to survive, but any indigenous person converting to Christianity in order to survive. And this is not to dog on Christian religion. I am very much a to each their own. I'm cool, you can practice whatever religion you want or not practice at all. But it was weaponized when it was used to convert Native people. It's because we were being seen as doing something wrong because we didn't worship the Christian God. So there is that kind of like ickiness, I guess, that goes along when you think about indigenous people being converted to Christianity. Many indigenous people felt that the God colonists was more powerful, and so clearly that was the right God to worship. Stockbridge, Massachusetts plays a significant role in our history. In 1734, a missionary by the name of John Sargent came to the Mohicans, us, in the village of Wachacook, a small little village in Stockbridge. That was what Stockbridge was referred to as the time, because it was in our homelands. It was one of our settlements. He preached to and baptized many Mohicans, and they started to take on Christian names. John, Rebecca, names that you would find in the Bible. In 1738, we gave John permission to start a mission in the village, and it's located on the Housatonic River near a great meadow bounded by the Berkshire Mountains. And I have to say, the Berkshire Mountains are beautiful. I was absolutely stunned with how beautiful the area was when I was in Stockbridge not that long ago. More settlers moved to the area, and after they moved to the area, they were all English settlers. The area was then renamed to Stockbridge because it reminded them of Stockbridge, England. So they named it Stockbridge. Other Native groups then also came to the area, and they decided they wanted to hear the mission, hear John's sermons and convert to Christianity. This would have been the Wappingers, the Brothertons, the Pequots, the Mohawks, who once beat us in the Beaver Wars, the Narragansetts, the Oneidas, and others. And these groups kind of merged with the Mohicans, and collectively we were all called Stockbridge Indians. They just blanketly named us Stockbridge Indians. In the town of Stockbridge, there were other significant buildings that were erected by us. A meeting house and many other significant locations within the town that are important to our history, and the town today still contains many historical documents that are important to our history. When I was in Stockbridge this past about a month ago, I went to the mission house because we were opening up an exhibit there, and excuse me, I walked into the mission house and immediately got very sad, and it felt and felt very heavy, because knowing what had happened in and around that house itself was very distressing to me. Knowing that my ancestors were preached to and converted to Christianity there because they were trying to survive. It was very hard to take on. And so it took a little while for me to be comfortable being at the mission house just because of the history that I knew that had happened there with my ancestors. Eventually, by the end of my trip, I could walk in and out of the building and I was fine with it. But I think having an understanding of that history, but also being able to empathize and feel what they might have been feeling at that time was extremely significant. So there were a lot of wars that happened, and Mohicans were involved in these wars every single time. Between 1700 and 1800, we were caught up in every war that happened on this continent. The French and Indian War was a conflict between France and England over the territory that was taken from Native people. The American Revolution was a war about creating a new nation on that stolen land. The War of 1812 saw Native nations who once fought on the side of the Patriots now fighting against them in order to retain some of their homelands. Between 1775 and 1783, Stockbridge Indians served in many battles in the American Revolution. Yes, we did fight on the side of the Patriots. My Oneida ancestors also fought on the side of the Patriots. That's kind of how the Iroquois Confederacy broke up, was you had some tribes who wanted to remain neutral, you had other tribes who would fight on the side of the British, and then you had others who fought on the side of the Patriots. And so there was a lot of inner fighting between Native nations when it came to the American Revolution. We were instrumental in the American Revolution. Us, along with Oneidas and Tuscarora and other Native nations, fought alongside the colonists in a group called the Stockbridge Militia. And the Stockbridge Militia actually fought under George Washington. And we fought in many, many different battles. The Siege of Boston, Battle of Saratoga, and the Battle of Kingsbridge in the Bronx. We were very good at what we did. And actually at the Battle of Kingsbridge in the Bronx was where we suffered the most casualties. But we still fought bravely amongst all of the other soldiers in there. We also fought in the French and Indian War, where we served in Rogers Rangers. It was 2 companies of Mohicans that served in Rangers during the French and Indian War. In 1783, George Washington held an ox roast for us in Stockbridge to thank us for fighting in that war, for being the backup that they needed. And honestly, if you really study the American Revolution and the history of it, a lot of things would have gone significantly different if it hadn't been for Indigenous nations. So if you look back to what was happening at Valley Forge and the famine and not being able to get food, it was the Oneida people, my people, who broke that famine and brought food to George Washington and his troops. It was also and other Indigenous nations who really came in at a time that was needed and really helped turn the tide of the war in favor of the Patriots. But after George Washington throws us this ox roast, we are then forced out of Stockbridge. We get back from war, and a lot of the land that we had been taken, and it had been taken for really, really petty reasons. We weren't there, debt, whatever reasons they could come up with, and we were eventually then forced out of Stockbridge. So after leaving Stockbridge, we moved to New Stockbridge, New York, near Oneida Lake. The Oneida who fought in the war with the Stockbridge offered us a portion of farmland and forest about 6 square miles. And we accepted that, and we moved there. About 300 of us moved there. Mary Dockstader and other women started a spinning school enterprise, and by 1850, it involved 60 Mohican women and girls. We also set up a grist mill and a school and basically created a whole new village. Between 1791 and 1793, Chief Hendrik Oppermont, who served as one of our greatest leaders, served as a peace commissioner. He represented the nation in the Ohio River Valley among traditional relations with the Lenape, the Shawnee, and others who were part of the United Indian Nations Confederacy that sought to maintain territory independent of the United States and British Columbia. And this would actually come under the rule of Tecumseh, who was a Shawnee who was raising an army of warriors to fight against the United States to retain some sort of traditional land base. So we, Hendrik Appomat joins up with them, tries to keep the peace and tries to keep, but he also is the one, Hendrik Appomat, who rides in the area and gets people involved in the War of 1812 when that starts to happen. And you see in the War of 1812, tides change. Those of us who fought with the Patriots during the American Revolution, after being forced off of our land, now fight for the British in the War of 1812 to try to regain some of that land back. Well, after we get all set up in New Stockbridge, we're then forced to move to White River. And the Lenape were living there at the time. The Lenape are also referred to as the Delaware because they were near the Delaware River, and that was a colonized name that was given to them. There was consistent pressure to move all of the time. And we journeyed to White River it took a year to get there. And when we got there, we discovered that the Lenape had been coerced into selling the land that they had. We were going to live with the Lenape. And John Sargent is quoted as saying, about a third of my church and a quarter of the tribe, which was about 70 souls, started from this place for White River. So about 70 souls traveled to White River, and we get there and we find out there's no place to stay. So we're basically couch surfing while leaders in New York are trying to negotiate for new lands in Wisconsin. We were led to White River by John Matoxen, who was also another great leader in our tribe. He also then helps lead us to Wisconsin as well. So we get to Wisconsin. Back in New York, before we get to Wisconsin, though, there's negotiations that are happening. So back in New York, people from the War Department, where at the time Indian Affairs was housed, were negotiating with the Menominee and Ho-Chunk people here in Wisconsin. A treaty was reached in 1822, and the Stockbridge moved again. This time we moved to Kaukauna, which was along the Fox River, and many others from New York who stayed behind joined us there in Kaukauna. We were perhaps the first English-speaking people in the area. Electa Qinney, who is a Stockbridge woman, was our first school teacher here. We had the first Protestant minister, and we had the first Christian temperance union in the area. But just because we were civilized didn't mean we were going to be able to stay for long. The Fox River became a major waterway. Wisconsin is known for dairy, obviously now, but lumbering, rich forests here. Lumbering and rivers, as we know historically, are used as ways of transportation. So the Fox River became a major waterway transportation, and we were forced to move again, this time to the east shore of Lake Winnebago in 1834. It was when we moved to that area, which is Stockbridge, Wisconsin, that a group of Munsee Lenape people came to join us. And that is when we became known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. So our name has taken many shapes over time. When you hear us refer to ourselves today, though, we a lot of times, 9 times out of 10, we will say Mohican Nation, Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation, Stockbridge-Munsee Band of the Mohicans. We make sure that Mohican is in there because we want everyone to know that we are Mohican. Finally, the federal government under Andrew Jackson was forcing removal and land cessions through a lot of Native tribes. Indian removal was passed in 1830, signed into law, and that basically started the Trail of Tears for a lot of the southeastern tribes in the United States. A group of Stockbridge Mohicans who feared the inevitable moved to Indian Territory in 1839, thinking we were going to be moved as well. Many died along this journey. Some reached Kansas and Oklahoma and married into other tribes. Others gave up and moved back to Wisconsin when it gained statehood in 1848. It was also during this time, too, that there were a series of treaties and congressional acts that were passed that really did affect the Stockbridge-Munsee community. You had the Congressional Act of 1843, which was passed, and it made the Stockbridge citizens of the United States. On paper, this doesn't sound absolutely terrible. But what it did is when it made us citizens of the United States, it stripped away our tribal sovereignty. It also divided up land that the nation held at Lake Winnebago. And in addition to that, it caused an internal conflict which divided the nation into two factions, Citizen Party and the Indian Party. And I can tell you today, even in 2021, you will still hear sometimes people saying, if you talk about the Indian Party or the Citizen Party, sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, that family, they were Citizen Party. And they say it with a little like snobbery because we remained Indian Party. And what that did is Citizen Party was all for the citizenship. Indian Party was not wanting to retain tribal sovereignty. The Indian Party stated that the Congressional Act stripped us of our rights to be Indian. So John Qinney, who was probably the greatest diplomat that we had at the time, greatest diplomat and leader, I would argue in history, traveled to Washington, D.C. a dozen times to lobby on behalf of the Stockbridge-Munsee people and to have that act overturned. So finally, the Congressional Act of 1848 was passed, and this reversed the Congressional Act of 1843. This became a concern when non-native people began to take advantage of those in the Citizen Party and started to buy up all the land around them. It reinstated the right to be a sovereign nation, and it also reimbursed the nation for improvements made to the land and held the money in trust to gain interest. But at the same time, we were on the move again. So we're still in Stockbridge, Wisconsin, which is in the southern part of Wisconsin. The Treaty of 1856 established a reservation for the Stockbridge-Munsee community in northeast Wisconsin in Shawano County, in the townships of Red Springs and Bartlemy. Farming was attempted, but the land was sandy and swampy, and it still is today. It's a lot more easy to farm, though. And forestry became the economy. Outsiders, though, came in and cleared the land, lumber barons. And in 1871, the tribe was forced to sell 54 sections of forested land in order to survive. So John Qinney is one of, again, like I said, one of the greatest diplomats, I would argue, that we have in Stockbridge-Munsee community. And I wanted to just take a moment and excerpt part of his 1454 speech that he did in Reidsville, New York. Let it not surprise you, my friends, when I say that the spot on which we stand has never been purchased or rightly obtained, and that by justice human and divine, it is the property now of the remnant of that great people from whom I am descended. They left in the tortures of starvation and to improve their miserable existence. These events not above our comprehension and for wise purposes. For myself and my tribe, I ask for justice. I believe it will sooner or later occur, and may the great and good spirit enable me to die in hope. So John Qinney did not mince words. The speech is actually much longer. I encourage you to find online to read it. I encourage you to read the whole thing. It has been compared a number of times to Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech. And so is his wonderful. He doesn't mix them. He talks about the atrocities that were committed against the Mohican people, against Indigenous people in general by the federal government. And it's really important to note that. The reservation, again, created in 1856 in the townships of Red Springs and Bartleme's. It, as you can see, it butts right up against the Menominee Reservation because it was Menominee land at one point, Ho-Chunk and Menominee land. The area was very rich in timber, and lumber barons came in and basically clear-cut the whole land. So in order to survive, the tribe, like I said, had to sell off 54 acres of this land. So we are virtually, by the 1930s, left landless. It's a very, very torrid tale of what happened to the Stockbridge-Munsee people to us once we got here. And so you would think that would have been it. That would have been the last of the Mohicans, except it wasn't, because we're a strong million people, and we were. The Indian Reorganization Act is passed in 1934, and this is after federal policies has started to take a toll on Native nations. The IRA stopped the policy of allotment, which was taking nations, dividing them up, and then selling off the excess land. It allowed tribal nations to form their own governments again. That is very important. In 1937, a constitution was written based on the model, and there is now a land base to build homes on. Stockbridge-Munsee regained 15,000 acres of land township of Bartlemy. 2,500 of those acres were placed in trust, and in 1972, the remaining 13,000 were then placed in trust. The Indian Reorganization Act encouraged the reestablishment of tribal governments by tribes across the nation. The tribe could adopt their own constitution, and they could draft their own. This is very important to understand. Under the leadership of Carl Miller, who is photographed in the top picture here, the Stockbridge-Munsee reorganized their tribal government and regained federal recognition. Using federally secured funds through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the tribe managed to buy back that land that they had lost. Currently, the Stockbridge-Munsee we have a land base that's just under 25,000. But that all started with reorganization and regaining that land back. The bottom photo here, a picture of Miller, who was tribal president for 26 years. And Arvid was instrumental in his own right that he helped form the Great Lakes Intertribal Council, is glitzy, but he also helped form the National Congress of the American Indians, which is the largest group, lobbying group in Washington, D.C. to fight on behalf of Indigenous rights. Today, we are the largest employer in Shawano County. We have a land base that is just under 25,000, and we have enrollment of around 1,500 people. Actually, I believe that number is more closer to 2,000 now. So we take our role as being the largest employer in the county very seriously. That is very important to us, and we understand the duty that we have to those in the community. And just a little bit about our Cultural Affairs Department. Houses 3 programs. The first is the Arvid E. Miller Memorial Library and Museum. It acts as a library where you can check out books, but it also is a museum where we house cultural significance to our community, and it is obviously named after Arvid E. Miller. And it also hosts the largest set of Mohican archives in the world. Anything you want to know about Stockbridge-Munsee people, you will find here. We have our Historic Preservation Program, which is actually located in Williamstown, Massachusetts at Williams College, so right smack dab in the middle of our homelands. And this office is tasked with preserving and protecting sites of cultural significance to Stockbridge-Munsee community, in addition to our greatest role of repatriating ancestors whose remains have been housed in museums. And we are able to repatriate those and bury them, give them back the proper burial that they deserve, but also go and find objects of cultural significance that should be in our possession and not just out there in museums. The second is language revitalization. We are in fact 2 recognized in our tribe. We have our Munsee language, which revitalization with that started in the 1960s and 70s with community members traveling to Moravian Town in Canada, where the language was still fluently spoken. They immersed themselves in that, and then brought that language back to the community. And then just within the past few years, it hasn't even been a decade yet, within the past few years, we've taken the Mohican language, which just lived on paper, and started to bring it back alive again. The last fluent speaker of the Mohican language died in the 1930s. And from that moment on, the language was just on paper. We had nobody who could speak it. We don't have anyone who can fluently speak it now, but we have worked very close to come towards speakers. And it is feeling very strong in in their department. And I'm very excited to see what can happen in the next few years, where we may actually end up with those first language speakers again and fluent speakers. And just for reference, these photos were taken pre-pandemic. We have not had any large gatherings since the pandemic happened. And I lastly want to leave you with our Many Trails symbol. It was created by Edwin Martin, who is Stockbridge Mohican man who created this symbol, and it means strength, endurance, and survival. And every single line on this symbol means something. So you'll see the straight lines, show the trails that we've been on. But you also see at the top of the straight lines, it forms a cross. And then the curved line is hands raised in prayer. So that represents Christian converting to Christianity, worshiping God and or the Great Spirit. The circles represent our council fires. Our council fires is our seat of government. And obviously our seat of government has moved several times, but the circle is all encompassing, represents the fire and it shows that our seat of government today lies in Bowler, Wisconsin, whereas one of our first council fires was at Skodak Island. So the seat of government moved every single time we moved. So that seat of government today resides in Bowler, Wisconsin. And so this, again, strength, hope, endurance, and survival. I think it really represents the resiliency of our people. And it is a symbol that if you see, automatically that's Stockbridge-Munsee. A few books that you may want to or check out. The first few are books that represent Stockbridge-Munsee history, A Nation of Statesmen by James Oberly. This book, again, is great because we were a nation of diplomats, of statesmen, of lawyers who lobbied on behalf of the Stockbridge-Munsee community. You have the Mohicans of Stockbridge, and then the Mohicans and Their Land and the Mohican World, both by Shirley Dunn. They are unfortunately out of print right now, so if you can find them, they're going to be very expensive. But before I did leave my position at Stockbridge-Munsee Community, I did negotiate with the publisher to get some of these read, so they will be available at the Stockbridge-Munsee gift shop here in Wisconsin, and you can call, pay over the phone, and we do ship. So those are really good. But the next two are books I think you should have in your library for overall Indigenous history. And that is An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and then The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer. An Indigenous People's History follows the Indigenous history of this country prior to and during colonization. You cannot have the United States without having the history of the Indigenous people told. They're intertwined. Our history is older than that of the United States, and it's very important to know that. The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer picks up where Dee Brown left off with Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. In Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Dee Brown stops at 1890, saying all resistance, Indian resistance, is over. That is just not true. Resistance still happened, and I argue maintains today. It just took a different form. And The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer talks about that. I actually, in March, did a virtual interview with David Troyer, which you can find on the Cultural Affairs Department's page, which is the Arvid E. Miller Library, Museum, and Cultural Affairs Department, where we talk about this history and the importance of that. So these are books that I recommend should be in your library, on your Kindle, however you want to read them, but they are extremely important and can help you learn more about Stockbridge-Munsee people, but also Indigenous people as well. And then finally, I do share a lot of stuff on social media, particularly in my new job with Forge Project. So you can follow me on the Twitter and Instagram, where I post historical things and fun things. And then you can see fun pictures of my dogs if you want. So I absolutely want to thank you guys all for taking time out of your evening to speak or to hear me this evening talk about history that I am super passionate about. I am first and foremost a historian, and I am an Oneida and Stockbridge-Munsee woman who is passionate about our history. So I'm very excited that I was able to share this with you this evening on apparently this inaugural guest speaker series. So thank you so much for joining me. And with that, I'm going to mute myself, take a drink of water, and open it up to questions.
Thank you so much. We'll wait for you to hydrate before we start asking you questions.
Here we go. I'm good.
You're good.
I haven't mastered the taking a drink of water while talking yet.
Yeah, I don't think anyone has.
Right.
It doesn't sound safe.
Yeah.
So I am going to read the questions in the order in which they appeared.
Okay.
And we'll see how we do. It's not too many yet. So the first question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say questions. I mean, it can be about Stockbridge-Munsee. It can be about Indigenous history. I specialize in federal Indian policy. So if you have questions about that, there's no question that is offensive. You can ask me anything because if you don't know something, I would rather you ask.
Thank you. That's great. Great to know. Yeah. Okay, so here's one to start. Sarah Davis says, I'm wondering what your stance on the hashtag land back movement is. Does your nation have a policy in place for accepting ancestral land back?
We do not have a policy in place. That is something that we have discussed. It's very difficult when we are not in our homelands anymore. We don't want to be those absentee landholders, but we also, prior to my leaving too, we're trying to come up with a way of how we could do that. In fact, just before I left earlier this year, we did retake ownership of Qinney Island, which is an island in the Mohican that is it's a nominee for the National Registry, and we just got a grant to actually move it to the next level to actually have it become a historic on the National Registry for historic places, not just a nominee, but an actual labeled historic place. And that island is significant because it's named for Qinney, who was one of our sachems or leaders. He was one of our leaders in the 1600s, and that's where he lived. And the island, there is some agricultural development on one side of it, but on the other side of it, it's completely untouched. And so that is really important, and that is very significant to us. Land back is more than a hashtag. I encourage you to visit the NDN Collective to learn more about land back and how it originated. And the idea behind land back it first launched last year on Indigenous Peoples Day, but it's an idea that's been brewing for a very, very, very long time. It's the concept of just that, returning the land back to the Indigenous people. And one of the big issues that land back is tackling is the return of the Black Hills to the Lakota. This summer, I actually did an entire talk out in the Black Hills at the Crazy Horse Memorial on why or how the Black Hills were stolen and the fight to get them back. And I basically told a group of tourists who came to hear this talk, explain to them why they shouldn't be there, why the museum I was talking in shouldn't exist. And it was actually very well received. I was a little nervous giving that talk, but it was well received, and understanding the concept of land back and what it means, and understanding that this continent, Turtle Island, is all Indigenous land. And so again, you can visit the NDN Collective. And also, if you're going to follow the hashtag land back, you can follow it on various social medias and learn more about what it means and the importance of it.
Okay, so that's the NDN Collective.
Yes.
I'm gonna put that in the chat and I will look that up. Okay. We have a whole bunch of people saying thank you, and this was a wonderful talk. And the next question, do the Stockbridge-Munsee people have any interest in coming back to visit Stockbridge, Massachusetts?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Every year there used to be what we called historical trips where you rent the charter buses and you plan out the map and all of that, and there trips would be taken. In the past couple of years that have happened, and then obviously with COVID that has not happened, but yes, there is trip. People do want to come back out to the homelands. I mean, it's our home. it's our home. And so we, I'm hoping that in my new position, I'm able to maybe help make more of that happen. But yes, we come out to Stockbridge as often as we can when there's not a pandemic.
Is it okay to ask you right now just like one sentence of what the Forge Project is?
One sentence.
Or sorry, that's just I feel bad because I'm jumping in when other people have questions, but because you mentioned your new position.
Yeah. So really quickly, it won't be one sentence, it might be a couple sentences, but I'll keep it very brief. So please, you can go to project.com to learn more, but in a nutshell, Forge Project is a new organization that is based on the ancestral homelands of my ancestors, the Mohican people in upstate New York, which I will be moving to in October. But it is raising awareness of Indigenous issues in Indigenous communities by supporting those on the ground who are working in climate justice, cultural awareness, and social justice. And we do that by providing fellowships to these Indigenous movers and shakers in their community, because we understand that to do this work is taxing. It can take a toll, and oftentimes you can't devote as much to this work that you want because there are other things you have to worry about. You got to pay your rent, you got to pay daycare, you got to buy food. And we provide a fellowship that allows you to do this work without having to worry about those things. In addition to that, we are promoting the awareness of Indigenous artists who do not get the same level of notoriety as non-Indigenous artists. So you can't completely strike down capitalism, but you can manipulate the way that it's used, right? So we can bring awareness and get Indigenous artists into spaces that they may not have been able to get in before. And then finally, the third thing that we work on that I oversee is the institution of small seed grants for cultural and educational institutions that are looking to decolonize their curriculum, their programming, their museum labels, things like that. Having been in the museum world, the one thing that stands in your way is lack of funds. And so that is something that we want to change. And then I will also continue to be doing talks like this, trainings for different organizations who are working on land acknowledgements or want to know more about cultural appropriation, but in addition to all of the other educational talks that I do. So that is Forge in a nutshell, but you can go to forgeproject.com to learn more.
That's so exciting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. How can we help get these books and this history incorporated into mainstream schools? And how do you cope with the injustice of false stories being taught in schools?
Oh, God. So if you contact our Cultural Affairs Department, we actually do have 4th and 5th grade curriculum that was designed that is actually, it's used in a couple of the neighboring school districts here in Wisconsin, but I know it's also used in a couple of districts out east. And they're working on developing curriculum for higher grades. I would contact your local libraries, your school libraries, what have you, to see if they have these books in their libraries that people and children can check out. If they don't, I would encourage you to push that. And then the way I combat the way historical narratives are told is doing this. I talk about history as it is. I'm a big advocate for truth telling, whether that truth is difficult or not. Obviously, you're not going to talk about genocide in 2nd grade, but there's a way that you can talk about history that allows it to be told truthfully. So there's a lot of myths that I combat, whether that's the story of the first Thanksgiving, Pocahontas, or anything really. It's difficult. When I do a lecture on a historical event or something, and people come up to me afterwards or in the chat afterwards saying, I didn't know this, I didn't learn this in school, or I was always told it was done this way. I feel like I was lied to. And it's like understanding, number one, I'm very understanding of teachers and the amount of things that they have to cram into a school year that is just, it's ridiculous. So I get that. But that's why there are me and other Indigenous educators out there who are there to combat those narratives and working on articles that can be published and putting things on our social media to where you can understand that. So I just combat it by just doing stuff like this, by just being out there, being in front of it, and telling the truth.
Great. You need a break. There's a few more questions.
I'm good. I just had to cough. I'm good.
Okay. Okay, this question is about the language. Is your language spoken today? Is it taught to youth today?
So the language is spoken today by some people, by those of us who are learning. I don't really speak it. When I was the director, I never had time to jump in on classes. Now that I'm not the director anymore and I can really set my own schedule, I definitely will be jumping in on language classes and learning, because I would like to know how to speak it better. One of our language teachers, Brock Schreiber, who is actually also one of our inaugural Forge Fellows, has three little kids, and a baby. The baby is 10 months old, and from the time that the baby's been born, Brock's been speaking to the baby in Mohican as much as he can. And he's also our Mohican language instructor as well. And so his children do speak it. They don't speak it fluently, but they speak it conversationally. Like, you could have small little conversations with it. And Bonnie Hartley, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Manager, her son can speak Munsee. So the children are learning. They are speaking it, and the language program has only been an official tribally funded program for just over a year. So we're still working on building it up. So once that gets built up more, I can guarantee you will hear more people, particularly more children, speaking it.
That's really cool. Great. Okay, the next question is about your new job and what you'll be doing, which you already mentioned. And it looks like Dan put the link to Forge Project in the chat. I also saw an article in Times Union from earlier this summer about it. And so I can try to find that again to put it in the chat. And yeah, I think that the Forge Project is definitely something that we at RPA will want to connect with and support. And I hope other people do as well.
100%.
Yeah, cool. And that's exciting that you're moving here too.
I'm so excited.
Okay, Annie says, my mom is surprised you didn't comment on Qinney Island, but you did in your question. So I guess
I did eventually talk on it. Yes.
Yeah. And there is also a great video from OSI about that transfer.
Yes. This is an amazing video that OSI did. We're so grateful to OSI.
Yeah. Let's see. Can you speak to how we can acknowledge the Indigenous lands when we do environmental education on the lands in the Hudson Valley?
Yes, absolutely. So I do various workshops on land acknowledgements and how to write them and the meaning behind them and what they're meaning and what they need. And if anything, when you're doing a land acknowledgement, there needs to be action behind those steps, right? So it's great that if you're an environmental organization and you're doing a land acknowledgement, but you need to have some action and some connection with the tribal nation that you're honoring. So whether it's Stockbridge-Munsee or whether it is another tribal nation, there has to be that land connection, because us as Indigenous people, it's not just land. It is a living and breathing entity. So none of you on here can tell me you've never met an Indigenous person, because as long as you are standing on Indigenous land, you've met an Indigenous person. So if you're standing on Mohican land, that land is Mohican. or this land is Oneida, or this land that I'm on is Menominee. So the land it's part of us, it's living, it's breathing, it's who we are. So it's important to have that kind of narrative in your acknowledgement when you are working, especially if you're an environmental group, or a land conservation group that's talking about the importance of that land. But then having stories from the indigenous groups to incorporate in your talking and in your teachings, but don't ever incorporate those talkings and teachings without involving that indigenous group. That is where I think a lot of people can get into trouble. They think they're honoring the group, but if a tribe doesn't know anything about it, we think you're just appropriating our history. So it's important to have that involvement first and foremost. And when I do these land acknowledgement trainings, these workshops, that is something that I stress so much.
So you're saying it would be better to, rather than to put out a land acknowledgement, to first make that contact and that connection.
I recommend it. I recommend it. If you've already written a land acknowledgement, it's 2 seconds to put it in an email, send it to the tribal group, and have them approve it. I swear half the time I was working for Stockbridge-Munsee, I was approving land acknowledgements. I would read through, I'd make little suggestions here or there, like this is great, whatever. And then I would send it back. So it's just getting that. It's acknowledging part of the land acknowledgement. One of the main parts of a land acknowledgement is inserting awareness of Indigenous people that we're still here. So if you don't include that Indigenous nation, you're adding to the erasure.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Dale asked if you could put the name of the gift shop that you talked about in the chat so that we can support the Stockbridge-Munsee community and any other ways that we can support. Yeah.
I will do you one better. I am going to put the link to the Cultural Affairs page in the chat. And that link will take you straight to Cultural Affairs Department. It'll show you all of our donation links. It'll give you links to the library, to historic preservation, and to language, where you can donate to any one of those programs. And it'll also show you where the gift shop is, and you can call in order to make purchases.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Our next question. Leslie asks, she says, thank you for a reference of US history rather than American history. Recently, I was made aware of the reference to American or Western Hemisphere Indigenous peoples as the nations of the Americas. Can you comment?
I don't think I understand the question.
I don't know if I do either. Leslie, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Okay, well, we'll skip. If Leslie comes back, you can unmute and ask that question.
Yeah.
Okay. Hamni asks, when we do forest education, it seems like we should talk about historic Indigenous uses, but I feel a little funny being a white girl telling people about this, if you understand what I mean. It is so important, but I am not sure how to present it.
You reach out to the Indigenous nation and they will work with you on how to do it.
Great.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah. And thankfully, Heather is very patient. We can tell, and willing to work with us from wherever we're coming.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Coley asks, would it be offensive to the Stockbridge-Munsee people to represent your history or story in artwork?
That is an interesting question. I would like to say no, but on the stipulation that you let us in on the artwork that you're doing, your vision, sketches, whatever, and allow us to be able to, obviously, nobody is going to tell an artist how to represent a work, but let us see it and be part of that creative process with you.
Great. And who would they reach out to, you or someone else at Stockbridge-Munsee, or?
They could reach out to the Cultural Affairs Department. I loosely am still doing some consulting for the department because they haven't filled my position yet there. But I would reach out to, if anything, I would reach out to the library museum specialist there.
Okay, super. Okay. Few more questions.
No, you're fine.
It's okay. Okay. That's great. All right. Eric asks, do you have recommendations for how organizations working on the ancestral lands of Native people can honor and represent the Native history of the land where we work, which I think we've talked about with the land acknowledgements, but if you want to add anything.
Yeah, no, I would just say first and foremost, you need to do land acknowledgements, and behind those land acknowledgements, there needs to be action. There needs to be steps. And just I will probably regret this in the morning, but I'm going to put my email address in the chat because I can help you with that. It's not hard to do land acknowledgements. It's understanding it, though. It's time-consuming work. It's rewarding.
Oops. I think you cut out for 1 second, but.
Oh, am I back? Okay.
You're back now. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. Anna says, thank you for this powerful presentation, Heather. Was your tribe able to bring traditional foods with them as they were forcibly moved? Are there Lenape Mohican seed banks? Are there any ongoing efforts for continuing important species and foods?
Yes, there is. We have a great agricultural agent who has the past few years taken a tiny little plot of land and grown it into a 6-acre farm / garden, so to speak, by bringing back traditional crops. There is the Native American seed, something. Oh God, I can't remember the last word. It's like archive or seed bank or something, but it is a collection of indigenous seeds through that are indigenous to various tribes. So we actually, I know we have like Munsee tobacco, and I think there's Munsee beans, and also in the gardens practicing the traditional ways of planting. So doing Three Sisters, doing, ceremony before planting tobacco, and things like that. So there are traditional ways that we're starting to bring back while providing fresh fruits and vegetables for the community. And so food sovereignty is also something that's really big in Indigenous communities. And if you can do that through fresh fruits and vegetables in a little way, providing those to the elders and those in the community, that's huge. But yes, there are ways of bringing back that that traditional way of doing things.
Great. Okay, Elise has another question about places to donate, which you did talk about, but also other ways to take action, particularly as a homeowner on this land, on the ancestral lands of your people.
Yeah. So there's obviously, you can make donations to Stockbridge-Munsee community. You can, donate through the Cultural Affairs Department. There is this idea of people do, it's called a voluntary land tax. We were writing a policy on that when I left. I'll probably something else probably still write, in my new role, but it's, a tax that people put on themselves to donate back. But also Indigenous causes in general are good to donate to. So there's different organizations. There's tribal colleges that you can donate to, which support Indigenous communities. There is NARF, which is the Native American Rights Fund, which fights on behalf of Indigenous people and Native sovereignty and make sure treaty rights are being upheld. But then right now, this very moment, you can donate to Honor the Earth, which is an organization which is led by Winona LaDuke, who is a great Ojibwe activist who is up there right now in Minnesota fighting her butt off to stop Line 3. So I would highly recommend that people donate to Line 3 right now, the bail funds and all of that, because Line 3, which is being hosted by Enbridge, is a whole big fiasco. Like what happened with Dakota Access, Line 3 is threatening the Mississippi River, and it is on treaty land, Ojibwe treaty land. So we want to make sure that we are donating to those water protectors who have been up there through this really weird hot summer fighting.
Great. Okay, so we have a bunch of resources that some people have added. Celia has added a few links that I need to figure out how to save this chat and to make sure that we can keep all of this. Got a lot going on here. Celia asks, the people over here want to know, how do you relate to your identity as an American citizen? What is your vision for the future of your people and for this country as a whole? Thanks, just a tiny question, she says.
Such a loaded question. Good question, just loaded question. I always, first and foremost, identify myself and refer to myself as an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation and a first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. I rarely ever say, like, you know, oh, citizen of the United States. Like, yes, I am a citizen of the United States according to the law. I was born here in the country, and you know, my parents are citizens of the United States and all of that. But I definitely identify more with my Indigenous citizenship. But it's very weird because I'm a historian. My first love was colonial U.S. history, so the founding. I did my thesis on Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. I have a very weird and unhealthy obsession with Thomas Jefferson. That's okay. But so I definitely am fascinated with the founding and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and I love policy. I'm a nerd, but I love policy and I love the law. And so it's very odd, but I think what I like most is being educated and having an understanding of that policy and federal law. I like to use it to further Indigenous causes and further the rights of the Indigenous people. I always say the most dangerous people in the world are educated Indigenous people, because we've been educated in the Eurocentric school system. We know how it works. We understand the law of the United States and the Constitution and the history, and then we can turn around and use it to further the causes of our people. And actually, Angela Davis, if you're not familiar with Angela Davis, amazing, one hell of an activist in Black rights and civil rights movements, did the exact, when she was arrested for crimes that she was later acquitted of because they were bogus charges, she used the law in order, as a Black woman, she used the law in her favor. And if you read transcripts and you watch the court proceedings, they tried to get her with everything, and she just came back with that, like, oh, nope, it says this. Nope, it says this. And so that's what I tend to do with my education and with my understanding of policy. So yeah, I'm an American citizen. I vote in elections. I'm very passionate about voting, but I'm more passionate about getting my Indigenous brothers and sisters out there voting, right? That is what I'm working for. I'm working to further the causes of Indigenous people, because that is who we were here first, and our voices might be small, they are mighty. So it's a weird dynamic for me personally, and I'm sure for every Indigenous person, on how we identify.
Thank you. That was quite a courageous answer. Okay. So there's really just one more question. There are a lot of voices of appreciation, people who are just really appreciated your time. The last question is a good one. Anna asks, I have heard that there may be issues with non-federally recognized tribes making certain claims in New York and New Jersey. What is your take on this?
I feel like I can answer this more freely because I'm no longer an employee of a federally recognized tribe. um, I am never one to question anyone's identity, anyone's ancestry, anyone's family history. I know that whole thing with um, Elizabeth Warren, and people ask me about that, and I'm like, is her family history, did she present it in the right way? Absolutely not. But I'm not going to question your history, and I'm not going to question what you were told. Indigenous people for years have been fighting for who they are and our history and to be recognized. And the fact that we have a system in the United States where a tribe has to be federally recognized is a very colonized way of thinking. So I don't question the legitimacy of a non-federally recognized tribe, but I question a non-recognized tribe's motives when they form themselves as a corporation as opposed to a tribe, or when they come in and start to redefine the history of an area without working with the federally recognized nation. It's a very fine line to walk. So I'm never going to say, so working with Stockbridge-Munsee and also the other federally recognized Lenape nations, there are nations out there who have resolutions or declarations that say they do not work or associate with non-recognized tribes. Stockbridge-Munsee doesn't have that, but we are very careful with who we associate with. And I myself, as a historian, when I was a representative of the Stockbridge-Munsee community, I'm also very careful of who I associate with. But it's a fine line to walk. And I don't want to say that everyone out there has ill intentions, but there are people out there who do have ill intentions, who present themselves in a way that is not Indigenous, that's not our Indigenous way, and try to cause issues where there shouldn't be any issues. We did have an incident with one person while I was working at Stockbridge-Munsee where we did issue a cease and desist letter because it got very bad. That person still continues to do whatever it is that they're doing, but and that person is out east in the homelands. And so I, in a very weird way, am very excited to be moving to the homelands where I can continue to be a voice for the original inhabitants of that land and make sure that that person knows you're not going to bully us and things like that. So it's a fine line to walk. And it's a complicated history because in one way, I want to say to have to go through a process of being federally recognized is unheard of. We were here first. We know we were here first. History says we were here first. But at the same time, when you are federally recognized, there are benefits and things that come along with that we don't allow non-recognized tribes to take advantage of. So it's a very weird situation to be in. So I don't really know how else to answer that.
Yeah, it sounds very complicated and not clear. Well, thank you so much for answering all these questions, for your time, your energy, and again, we're excited that you're going to be closer back in the homeland and excited to work more with you.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's all. People who are still on the call, make sure you sign up for the next talks and learn more, and we'll build on our learning throughout the next couple of months.
We thank you guys so much for having me. Thank you for taking part of your evenings to learn something you might not have learned. My email is somewhere in the chat. So if you have questions or you want to collaborate and work together, just feel free to reach out.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you guys. Yeah.
Yeah,
Bye.
see ya.